I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, after Donald Trump says Putin talks nice, then bombs everybody in the evening, the world is braced for a potential uptick in US support for Ukraine, and we report how Ukraine says it has killed the Russian agents responsible for assassinating an SBU officer last week.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 14th of July, 3 years and 142 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I'm joined by the Kyiv Independent's Francis Farrell, fresh from the battlefields of Pokrovsk, and later you'll hear a short dispatch from the Telegraph's Memphis Barker from the same sector. But first, the major political and military updates since Friday. So today is going to be, we are told, a big day for America's policy towards Ukraine. We're expecting an aggressive, that's a quote, aggressive response from Donald Trump to Vladimir Putin. This comes from a number of American politicians and other reports. Trump's expected to announce the sending of offensive weapons to Ukraine, having become frustrated with Vladimir Putin's refusal to end the war, reports suggest. The US president announced yesterday that he's going to give Kyiv Patriot missiles and long-range missiles that can strike targets deep inside Russian territory. This comes from US news website Axios, citing two sources with knowledge of the plans. Now, Mr. Trump was reportedly convinced to send this shipment and break the deadlock after a recent phone call with Putin, during which Putin said he would escalate the war with a new offensive. Now, this conversation apparently happened on July the 3rd. Putin reportedly said that Moscow intended to continue offensive operations until it had secured the full administrative borders of the 4 occupied oblasts in the east, none of which he currently holds in its totality. So after that conversation, as I say, on July the 3rd, Mr. Trump reportedly told French President Emmanuel Macron he wants all of it, meaning Ukraine. He wants all of it. And then Donald Trump has obviously, appeared to turn against Putin in recent weeks, calling him crazy, saying he's been peddling bullshit. Then yesterday, he said Putin, quote, talks nice, but then he bombs everybody in the evening. There's a bit of a problem there. I don't like it. He was speaking to reporters at the airbase waiting to get on Air Force One. Now, Lindsey Graham, the Republican senator close to Mr. Trump, said that Donald Trump is really pissed off at Putin. His announcement tomorrow, i.e. today, Monday, is going to be very aggressive. Now, there's speculation that this announcement is going to include the release of JASSM weapons, so the Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile, the newer variants of which is a cruise missile. The newer variants have a 500-mile range, about 800-kilometre range, can be fired from F-16s. Now, that is just speculation, so let's wait and see. Let's not go any further on idle speculation. So, as I say, I think it's going to be a big day. If nothing much happens from this announcement, or if Donald Trump says he's going to have to think about it for another couple of weeks, after we've all been marched up the hill, I think this is going to say a lot about US diplomatic power at the moment. See whether or not it actually comes up with the goods, or, in the words of one of our brilliant listeners from Texas, is he all hat and no cattle? Anyway, I'll come back to the diplomatic updates shortly. Let's go to the battlefield updates. Overnight Saturday, Sunday, Russia launched another large-scale drone and missile strike against Ukraine. This is the third combined strike with over 500 drones and missiles in July alone. So 597 drones and 26 Kh-101 cruise missiles were fired. Most drones and all but one of the cruise missiles were brought down either by being shot down, brought down by electronic warfare, or, in the case of the drones, lost to radar. 3, apparently, we are told, went back into Belarus, with one being shot down by a Belarusian helicopter, Mi-24 Hind. Now, Ukrainian officials said the strikes damaged critical electrical networks, other national infrastructure, and civilian areas across the country. 2 people were reported dead in the western city of Chernivtsi in an apparent cluster munitions strike. You'll find footage of that on social media. 2 people, friends of this podcast, I won't name, but who you will know for their work, were impacted by that, their families, but they are all safe, I'm told. Now, also hit were Cherkasy, that's right in the centre of the country, that's south of Kyiv. Also hit Kharkiv, Kyiv City and Oblast, Lviv, Sumy and Volyn Oblast. That Volyn is right in the far northwest of the country, borders Belarus to the north and Poland to the west. Kyiv Oblast Military Administration head Mikhailo Kalishnik said Ukraine's Clean Sky program, which uses interceptor drones to defend Kyiv Oblast, downed over 50 drones during that strike. I'll be talking more about the Clean Sky program shortly. On the ground, pressure continues in the far northeast of the country. Russian forces recently advanced from the international border at Malove and a little, about 5 kilometres southwest of there, inside Ukraine. Now, this is in the northeast of Kharkiv Oblast, about 60 kilometres east of Kharkiv city, 30 k's southeast of Chansk being that other lodgement that Russia has held for, well, crikey, it's got to be close to a year now, isn't it? They may be possibly trying to link up, although there's no sign of that at all, but they might be trying to establish that buffer zone that Vladimir Putin keeps talking about. Although, if it's ground you hold in someone else's country, it might be better to characterise it not as a buffer zone, but as an invasion. Anyway, that's just me being picky, I suppose. Now, the Institute for the Study of War, citing geolocated footage published on Saturday, said Russian forces had recently advanced southwest of Malove, as say that village up on the border. They said elements of the Russian 83rd Motorised Rifle Regiment and the 72nd Motorised Rifle Division first moved into the area earlier this month. The reason I name those units is because Russian forces, including elements from those, had been used in Kursk and Sumy Oblast and may now be returning to try and continue the fight in northeast Kharkiv. That might indicate that the Kursk operation is done and the Sumy operation has stalled. My assessment, my speculation. The Ukrainian Kharkiv Group of Forces spokesperson Lieutenant Colonel Pavlo Shemshin said last week that Russia has increased artillery and drone attacks in that area, northeast Kharkiv Oblast, of late. And last night, 136 drones and 4 S-300 or 400 missiles were fired. 6 killed, 30 injured across the country. Deaths in Sumy, Donetsk and Kherson. In Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, 3 people, including 2 13-year-old girls, were wounded by drones, according to Serhiy Lysak, who's head of the regional military administration there. Speaking on Telegram, he said defenders shot down 10 drones, but some managed to hit 2 districts. The 3 injured were hospitalised, with the girls in moderate condition and a 51-year-old man in serious condition. Elsewhere on the ground, continued move west by Russia in the Donbass, Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk, not encircled, but that's seemingly what they are trying to do, and they are making small gains in that area. Now, recent satellite imagery suggests Russia is constructing a protective structures operation. Some of the air bases following Ukraine's Operation Spiderweb. Ukraine-based open-source intelligence organisation Front Intelligence Insight says satellite imagery collected last week shows Russian forces have constructed roughly 10 reinforced bunkers with soil covering, so overhead covering, 12 concrete bunker-type structures without any overhead cover, and 8 hangar-style buildings on the aprons at Kalino Air Base in Kursk Oblast. In addition to that, Russian forces said to have constructed 2 concrete bunker-style structures at Saki Air Base in occupied Crimea, but no construction efforts seen at the Dzhankoy Air Base in occupied Crimea. I happened to be roaming around Google Maps this morning and I saw some nice helicopters sat at the Dzhankoy Air Base in occupied Crimea. And just in case you're interested, the latitude of that place is 45.700920, the longitude 34.414168, just in case you have your finger on a button. Anyway, Russian officials and mill bloggers have blamed Russian leadership for failing to defend Russian military infrastructure from Ukrainian drone strikes throughout the start of the full-scale invasion, but in particular since Operation Spider's Web. Institute for the Study of War say Russia may be starting to construct protective structures at its air bases after 3 years of war, and in particular in response to Operation Spider's Web. And in other news, Russian officials are busy shutting stable doors after numerous horses bolted from them. I made up the last bit. Okay, next one. Ukraine's military intelligence head, General Kirill Budanov, said on Friday that Russia's goal of seizing all of Donetsk Oblast by the end of 25 is not realistic. Contrasts those comments slightly by Ukrainian Presidential Office Deputy Head Colonel Pavlo Palisa, who said last month, June the 5th, that Russia intends to seize and occupy the full extent of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast by September this year. Of course, one is reporting on Russian intentions and Budanov is assessing those. So I suppose they do sit side by side. Now, last week, you'll remember, as we reported, The Economist assessed that it would take Russian forces until February 2028 to seize the remainder of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia Oblasts at the current rate of advance. Now, also from General Budanov's part of the ship, it's not a ship, if it was a ship they would have sunk it, I suppose, Russia has about 250 Iskander-M ballistic missiles and about 50 North Korean KN-23s in their inventory. If so, that would represent a significant reduction in Russia's assessed inventory, because in May, according to estimates, Russia had about 580 ballistic missiles in stock. So let's dig into the numbers a little bit. South Korean intelligence said yesterday that North Korea had supplied Russia with over 12 million 152mm artillery shells to support the war against Ukraine. Now, responding to that, Intel Shizo, the OSINT analyst active on Twitter, the individual I've cited before, I don't know who this person is, but their site was recommended to me by Britain's former Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, so I think that's probably good enough to cite with a few health warnings. But Intel Shizo says, in order to give a ballpark estimate of artillery rounds fired by Russia, from the start of the full-scale invasion to June 2022, they say Russia was firing up to 60,000 artillery shells a day. That makes over 7 million. Then from late June 2022 to October 2022, it slightly decreased to 30,000 shells a day, meaning just over 3.5 million. October 22 to March 2023, they fired 20,000 shells a day, making just over 3 million. And then from March 2023 to today, they've gone down from 60,000 to 10,000 shells a day, which is another 8.5 million. So what does that mean? Russia was estimated to have 16 million artillery shells stockpiled from the old Soviet days. Intel Shizo say they blew through that in late 2023. So they've fired just over 22 million. They've acquired 12 million, if this report from South Korean intelligence is correct. That leaves, on current rate, about 16 million shells on the shelf. Intel Shizo says this remaining stock of 16 million shells will allow Russia to have another 1,607 days of firing at a rate of 10,000 shells a day, or just over 2 years if they double that to 20,000 a day. Although they accept that Russia has opened new production lines in that time. So the numbers are interesting, doesn't show any immediate slowdown, but just puts things in perspective. Now, sticking with Ukraine's intelligence and security agencies, the SBU, the Security Service of Ukraine, said yesterday that it had killed Russian agents responsible for the assassination last week of that SBU officer in Kyiv. The two dead people who were allegedly ordered by Russia's FSB, the Federal Security Service, to kill the SBU officer were themselves killed during a shootout in a special operation, according to a statement. SBU head Lieutenant General Vasil Malyuk said in a video published yesterday by the agency, this morning, SBU forces were conducting an arrest operation of the agent and combat group of the Russian Federal Security Service, which was routed to Ukraine in advance and 3 days ago murdered an SBU officer, our brother-in-arms, Colonel Ivan Voronich. Now, this is continuing with the statement. According to the investigation, the killing of Colonel Voronich was carried out by two people, a man and a woman. Their handler is said to have ordered them to follow the officer to establish his daily routine, daily schedule and routes they took to work, and later gave them a location of a secret hide where a firearm and a suppressor were located. That all came from the SBU statement. Now, a few more for me. In the wake of reports that Russian Spetsnaz Major Volkov Alexander Alexeyevich, who's decorated as a hero of Russia, so goodness knows what he's been up to, he was killed in Ukraine on 18th of June this year in a missile strike. Now, in the wake of that, media company Malcontent News has done an investigation. They say that after declining for a number of months, the number of Russian officers being killed in action has increased sharply in recent weeks. They say this is because of Russia's top-down command structure and, in Russian forces, the lack of an NCO corps, the non-commissioned officers corps, corporal sergeants and what have you, the backbone of an army. That forces senior officers closer to the front than they would be in a Western model. Obviously, close to the front, drones can see everything and can call in fire or can strike themselves. Now, malcontent news say that when Russian battle plans fall apart, officers above company commander are often forced to go to the flot, that's the forward line of own troops, sometimes to take over, sometimes to enforce orders that are impossible to execute, sometimes to deal with refuseniks and insubordination, they say. Now then, back to the diplomacy, because I think that is the story for today. Speaking yesterday at Air Force Base Andrews outside of Washington, the president gets Marine One, the helicopter, from the lawn in front of the White House to Andrews Air Force Base, isn't that right? And then that's where Air Force One is sitting and off he goes. So speaking at Air Base Andrews, Donald Trump said, "We will send them Patriots, which they desperately need, because Putin really surprised a lot of people. He talks nice and then he bombs everybody in the evening. But there's a little bit of a problem there. I don't like it." Now, on the expected idea that NATO is going to compensate the United States for some of the arms provided to Ukraine, Donald Trump said, "We basically are going to send them various pieces of very sophisticated military equipment. They are going to pay us 100% for that, and that's the way we want it." Now, there's been a lot of diplomatic manoeuvring over the weekend. US Special Envoy for Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, he's arrived in Kyiv today. Ukraine's presidential office head, Andriy Yermak, announced it on Telegram, said defence strengthening, security, weapons, sanctions, protecting our people, strengthening cooperation between Ukraine and the US. There are many topics to discuss. Now, it's thought Germany may be the first out of the blocks to purchase any weapons, but specifically Patriot air defence from the US on behalf of Ukraine. Major General Christian Freuding, the chap I referred to earlier, the German Ministry of Defence's planning and command staff, he said on Saturday that Germany's Defence Minister Boris Pistorius and US Secretary of Defence Pete Hegseth had spoken a number of weeks ago about this possibility of Germany buying 2 Patriot air defence systems. And he also added that Donald Trump and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz had recently been talking about it as well, this potential sale. Now, General Freuding also said that Germany has opened a Patriot interceptor production line that will produce the first European-made Patriot interceptors in late 26 or 27. That's, well, good, but that's a little bit late, but I'm interested in this idea about NATO being the interlocutor to buy weapons from the US. So Boris Pistorius, German Defence Minister, he's on his way to Washington today. Speaking in advance to the Financial Times, he said Germany has already transferred 3 systems to Ukraine, and of the remaining 6 in Germany's arsenal, he said it is impossible to transfer more. This is the minimum for NATO. Hence this idea that Berlin's going to buy 2 systems from the US and transfer them straight to Kyiv. Mr. Pistorius also said Germany does not plan to transfer Taurus cruise missiles to Ukraine. Now, all this speculation about a kind of breakthrough or some way of unlocking Ukraine being able to buy off the open market, this was kicked off last week after Donald Trump said in an interview with NBC News that the US is going to sell NATO an unspecified number and type of American weapons, including Patriots, and then NATO will give them to Ukraine. So Axios, the US-based news website, reported on Friday that sources had said NATO allies had discussed the possibility of the US using NATO, as I said, as this intermediary to sell weapons to Ukraine. And those discussions were finalised, we are told, at the most recent NATO summit in June in The Hague. So Boris Pistorius is in Washington, as is Mark Rutte, NATO Secretary General. There's a lot of diplomatic heft to get this thing over the line. So Mr. Rutte is going to be meeting Donald Trump, Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth. Reuters report this is going to be the first time that NATO Sec Gen has met Donald Trump since the White House published that video, you may remember, of Mr. Trump titled Daddy's Home, a reference to when Mr. Rutte called Trump Daddy during that press conference at NATO. Anyway, let's move quickly on from that. I'm feeling a bit grubby. Now, adding to this diplomatic momentum, and speaking about this proposed big Trump announcement today, yesterday's Face the Nation on CBS News featured Senators Richard Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham. Now, Senator Graham told Margaret Brennan, the host, he said, "I don't want to get ahead of the president, but I'm having dinner, along with Senator Blumenthal and other senators, with Secretary General Mark Rutte tomorrow night." That's tonight, Monday. He said, "A turning point regarding Russia's invasion of Ukraine is coming. For months, President Trump has tried to entice Putin to the peace table. He's left the door open regarding Russia. That door is about to close. Dick and I have got 85 co-sponsors in the United States Senate for congressional sanctions with a sledgehammer available to President Trump to go after Putin's economy and all those countries who prop up the Putin war machine. China, India and Brazil buy oil and petroleum products and other goods from Russia. That's the money Putin uses to prosecute the war. And this congressional package that we're looking at would give President Trump the ability to impose 500% tariffs on any country that helps Russia and props up Putin's war machine. He can dial it up or down. He can go to 0% to 500%. He has maximum flexibility, but we're going after the people who keep Putin in business and additional sanctions on Russia itself. This is truly a sledgehammer available to President Trump to end the war. Now, I'm going to quote a bit more because I think it's quite important. Margaret Brennan then asked, how can you get them, that's Ukraine, how can you get Ukraine what they need if Congress will not approve in the House any new funding? Senator Graham said, well, just stay tuned for tomorrow's announcement. The idea of America selling weapons to help Ukraine is very much in play. I don't want to get ahead of the president, but stay tuned about seized assets. Stay tuned about a plan to go after the seized assets more aggressively. Stay tuned for a plan where America will begin to sell to our European allies tremendous amounts of weapons that can benefit Ukraine. Putin has calculated that we would get tired and Europe would get weary. He made a huge mistake. NATO is bigger and stronger, and we're more committed than ever to make sure he does not take Ukraine by force. So Congress is on the verge of passing the most consequential sanction package in the history of the country. It will give President Trump tools he doesn't have today, a literal sledgehammer. China, India and Brazil, you're about to get hurt big time if you keep helping Putin. Margaret Brennan then said, but Senator, respectfully, the president's rhetoric has changed this week on Russia. He's making clear his patience is very thin. But he's got right now at his fingertips just short of $4 billion in presidential drawdown authority. He doesn't need to ask Congress. He doesn't need to ask the Europeans for that money. He's got it if he wants to tap it. Wouldn't it be a stronger sign if he just sent those weapons or surged them? Senator Graham replied, well, the $4 billion is not nearly enough. I expect him to exercise that drawdown authority, but the game regarding Putin's invasion of Ukraine is about to change. I expect in the coming days you will see weapons flowing at a record level to help Ukraine defend themselves. I expect in the coming days that there will be tariffs and sanctions available to President Trump he has never had before. I expect in the coming days more support from Europe regarding the efforts to help Ukraine. Putin has made a miscalculation here. For 6 months, President Trump tried to entice Putin to the table. The attacks have gone up, not down. One of the biggest miscalculations Putin has made is to play Trump. And you just watch. In the coming days and weeks, there's going to be a massive effort to get Putin to the table. And to those who are helping him, China, buying cheap Russian oil and having no accountability, those days are over. Now, Moscow has shrugged off all this talk and this idea of resumed or increased US support. Dmitry Peskov, Kremlin spokesperson, said, now it seems that these supplies will be paid for by Europe. Some will be paid for, some will not. The fact remains that the supply of weapons, ammunition and military equipment from the United States continued and continues to Ukraine. And then Kirill Dmitriev, who's a senior advisor to Putin, said, constructive dialogue between Russia and the US will always achieve more than the tired, destructive language of pressure. Only cooperation brings real peace, stability and global security. So today's supposed to be quite big, but we have been here before, haven't we? We've marched to the top of the hill and we've been marched back down again. So I will wait and reserve my judgment and see what happens. And I will wait to see those weapons exploding against Russian targets in Ukraine or in Russia. So just promising it, delivering it, one thing, but I actually want to see these things going off before I believe what's coming out of the White House. I do have a hat and I will eat it if Donald Trump does come out with a monumental bit of news today in support of Ukraine. So those are the major updates. Before I talk to Francis Farrell, you'll hear a short dispatch from our senior foreign correspondent, Memphis Barker, who is recently in the same sector of the battlefield as Francis, Pokrovsk in the Donbass, where some of the fiercest fighting in the war is taking place. Memphis spent time with a group of Ukrainians risking their lives to restore electricity to the front lines.
We're in a car heading towards a village near Pokrovsk, where a team of electricity workers are going to fix some of the power lines that have been damaged in Russian shelling. The sound you can occasionally hear is a drone detecting system that the man taking us, Vitaly, uses to make himself aware of the threats in the area. We've just been told there's a reconnaissance drone around 400 meters from the car. Those are basically covering the entire area, and they watch him as he goes about his work all the time. He says that the threats around here have changed radically within the last 6 months. Vastly more drone coverage, but these men, they've been working in and around the front line for years now. What's the closest you've come to a drone, or your team have come to the drones recently?
Last week, 2 houses away from us. And also last week, a drone fell next to us because the military hit it. Somewhere here in residential buildings, a drone hit at 3 in the morning.
We're just driving now through the drone nets. They've been put up about 2 months ago to protect troops coming in and out of the front line from drones which are flying everywhere around us, as you can still hear from that beeping of the drone radar. Not long after we arrived here, we heard the sound of outgoing artillery fire.
Это выход, да? Пока это выход.
Outgoing.
So far it's outgoing. Где выход, там и приход. So it means soon will be the incoming.
And then moments ago, 4 more detonations. That was the sound of incoming guided bombs. The team working on the towers, their boss asked them, because they're a bit higher up, can you see the mushroom clouds and detonations? They said no. So for now the job continues, but it could be interrupted at any moment. It all depends on the Russians. If they leave, it'll leave the people here who are too poor to flee, without any electricity, no power. And they're really hopeful this team can stick around, taking the risks they take all year round to try and fix the cables that were damaged in artillery fire. What's next? Are you going to test it?
We have fixed it now. We need to go to the substation to turn on the power.
What's that sound?
Outgoing fire. This is HIMARS.
Okay.
Let's talk to our guest, Francis Farrell, live in Ukraine. Francis from the Kyiv Independent. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome back to the podcast. You were just in Pokrovsk, somewhere we've reported on for quite a while now. Sounds as if the picture there has deteriorated in recent weeks. I want to ask your reading of the situation there. But first, just on this big announcement today from Donald Trump, what do you think of it, and how is this speculation being received in Ukraine? Welcome back, Francis.
Yeah, g'day, Dom. Thanks for having me, as always. And yeah, it's a weird day to focus on the battlefield when so much is going on. I've talked about this before, that the whole peace talks theatre and this merry-go-round we've been on for the last few months has all been about Trump's final decision of whether to engage and really come down on Putin, because the only way to stop the war is to force Russia to stop quickly, or on the other hand, disengaging. And both options have obviously been very undesirable for him, actually doing a lot proactively to take on a dictator who he otherwise had pretty warm relations with, didn't want to do that. But the idea of stepping away finally and giving up completely, it looked for a while like that's what he would do, but he was brought back from the brink, at least. But I still remain, I think, about as skeptical as you that we will see anything akin to what's really needed. But it is a change of wind. I'm not going to lie. If we go all the way back to the Oval Office meeting and then all of the ups and downs, mostly downs, that we've seen since then, we are hearing and seeing different things. But I agree with you completely that until we see things exploding in Ukraine or in Russia, then I would not call it quickly.
Yeah, fair enough. So let's move on from this speculation. So, Francis, you were in Pokrovsk. What did you see? What's your assessment there and of the Donetsk front more broadly?
Yeah, so I went into Pokrovsk just over a week ago, and it was a bit of a surprise that we got this access and we got this opportunity, because not only my previous trip in April, but even the previous trip before that in February, Pokrovsk was already seeming a bit of a no-go zone. Definitely no going in with civilians or evacuation teams because of the control of Russian drones on all of the roads coming in and out of the city. It was back in February where that British volunteer was hit and lost an arm and a leg. But this time we had a brigade that we'd worked with before, the 68th Jaeger Brigade. And we asked to work with one of their drone teams, and they said yes. And sure enough, their sector is south of Pokrovsk, so it makes sense that they're working from inside the city itself. And once you're there, once you're in this basement inside the urban area, you feel pretty safe. There are glide bombs flying around, but we could even walk around and speak to civilians because the drones were not attacking random people on foot in between these buildings, but the road in and out was something I'd not seen before in all my time working around the front line. A lot of burnt out vehicles. Everyone is super on edge driving in and out, especially when they cross the railway line into the southern part of the city. And on the way out, I was in the back of a pickup truck sitting next to a guy whose job it was to try and shoot any Russian drones that would come and dive down on our car from the back. And at one point, it did seem like there was one Russian fixed-wing drone in the air, and it looked like it was coming at us. And he was basically to the point of raising his AK and shooting at it before the drone turned away. So that's the kind of tension that you see there. But speaking of the overall operational situation, it is indeed deteriorating. That brigade, their sector is south of the city, and famously, Pokrovsk is the city that broke Russia's offensive campaign over winter. They made it to the outskirts, they made some progress on the flanks, but eventually they were stopped, both on the outskirts and on the flanks. And that was when the whole front line was temporarily stabilized around February and March. But since then, we've all been looking at the map and we've all seen the progress that they've made pushing this salient deeper and deeper between the cities of Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka. And unfortunately, even just in the last few days, we've seen that salient make some significant gains westwards, coming around Pokrovsk from the northwest. It seemed for a while that there might be this swampy creek that might have been a place where Ukraine could make a stand and that could be stopped. But in the last few days on Deep State, we've seen them crossing that area. And that means that the road in and out, which Ukrainian logistics relies on to maintain a presence inside the city, is just getting more and more deadly. I was speaking to the same drone team yesterday. They said their car was damaged by a very, very near miss from a drone just a few days ago. And the concern is that, once again, we've seen this before, without having success in a frontal attack on a city, the Russians go around, they cut off logistics, and they make it untenable to defend the city itself. And back in Bakhmut, back in Avdiivka, we saw Ukraine very stubbornly, perhaps misguidedly, holding on to those like near cauldrons until the very last minute. But with Pokrovsk, I think what we'll see is, unfortunately, that it won't even get to that point, to the point where we see a true cauldron on the map. Instead, a true pocket, because the long arm of Russian drones is only getting longer and longer and more saturated. Roads we were driving on were attacked by FPV drones later, driving in our own rental car. Because of that, the logistics will be just untenable. And I think it's a matter of a few weeks. It might be longer before we see a complete withdrawal from the city. But yeah, things not looking good for Pokrovsk at the moment. The situation is less critical in nearby Konstantinivka, but I think that's by design because the Russians are really focusing on Pokrovsk first, and then they'll turn northeast to Konstantinivka.
Thanks, Francis. I'll ask you if you're able to comment on sub-tactical updates. So, for example, we see a lot of news and very well presented social media posts from brigades, for example, about unattended ground vehicles, ground drones, either for casualty evacuation or for ammunition and other logistic resupply. Now, I'm not sure that these things are in very widespread use. I think it's still quite early in their developmental phase, but you might think if you were just looking at some of these feeds that they were everywhere and they were very effective and it was all fine. So I wonder if you could comment, please, about ground drones. Secondly, drone nets. So these tunnels along roads that are the kind of wire mesh tunnels so that vehicles can drive along them and drones can't get in, or they just get tangled up on the netting. I've seen a number of videos showing particularly the fibre optic view FP or fibre optic supplied FPV getting underneath and inside these tunnels and still managing to hit vehicles. So are you able to comment on how safe these things are? And then finally, in terms of the Russian assaults themselves, we keep talking about meat assaults, and I understand that they are still happening, but I understand that they are in many places, particularly in the Donbass, that meat assaults are being used to find the weak links, but there are some much better trained Russian infantry behind them. So when they find a weak spot, then it's not just meat assaults that push through in weight of numbers, but there are some actually better trained Russian infanteers that actually try and exploit that success. Would you be able to those 3 points, please, and dial us back into where we are now halfway through 2025? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. It's the right thing to do to keep an eye on, because all of these things are just constantly evolving. To start with the ground drones, I do actually have some first-hand experience there, because on top of working in Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, we also worked with Ukraine's K2 drone regiment, which some listeners might have heard of. They did some very slick videos back when they were a mechanized battalion. And their commander, who we did a separate interview, which will come out eventually on our channel, he was a famous infantry commander. And so when his battalion was converted into a regiment of entirely drones, he came at that transformation with the idea that his first priority was always going to be doing what he can to protect and preserve the lives of Ukrainian infantrymen, even if they're not specifically under his command anymore. And so what that meant in reality is that when he could have just worked on UAVs, on drones in the air, he took it upon himself to really also develop in the sphere of UGVs, the ground drones. And what that unit has been doing has been really pioneering with the casualty evacuation stuff. We've seen UGVs do lots of logistics missions, and we actually embedded for a logistics mission with them. We've seen them do distance mining. We've seen kind of suicide UGVs just slowly creeping up to a dugout and blowing it up. But the casualty evacuation part, that's really the new frontier, and it's terrifying. It's nerve-wracking because you're basically handing over responsibility for the life of a soldier to a robot. It's obviously remote controlled, but there's no one there to actually give care to that wounded soldier in the first place. But the reason that units like K2 and other brigades are really trying to go forward with this is because the alternative is even worse. The alternative is evacuations being delayed for days and days and days, because that whole zone, especially the front line itself, but the whole zone closer than 5 kilometers from the zero, is just so deadly now. And they are a multi-tool. And other brigades have the opposite philosophy. They're like, however bad it might get, we still will only take responsibility for our casualties ourselves with human beings. That's the only way we can ever see ourselves doing it. So that's going to be super interesting to focus on. But in the meantime, they're being used more and more for logistics. And when we were there with one of them, they were actually delivering a new heavy bomber drone, like the Baba Yaga, the Russians call it, or a Ukrainian vampire. They were delivering a heavy bomber drone to a drone team, which was sitting about 5 kilometers out from the zero. And that heavy bomber drone, the primary function of that is now also logistics. So you have this chain like stretching out greater and greater distances that is now just the necessity to bring anything close to the front line. So that's UGVs. About the nets, yeah, they're everywhere now. They were on the road to Pokrovsk. They were on the road to Konstantinivka. And once you get close, you notice that they haven't succeeded in building them properly to cover the whole road in time. And now the Russians have gotten too close. The drones are controlling that area. And you just drive through these quite absurd, short little tunnels to get in. While I was there, they were putting up new nets further back, which is obviously good to do it more in advance, along the highway between Kramatorsk and Dobropilya, which at the time is still about 20 kilometers from the front line. But even then, a few days after we were there, that highway was also attacked. And I don't know if they made it around the net or they attacked an area where the net wasn't finished, but it is in itself another bit of a compromise that you're making there with the nets, because in general, what cars do if they notice a drone, whether that's visually or on their detector, is they immediately slow down and jam the car into the neighboring tree line. Everyone jumps out and then they try and shoot down the drone with small arms. It sounds terrifying, but that's the most effective way to do it. And now with these nets, you can't do that. And if a drone finds the entrance or finds a hole, or you send two at once, one to make a hole and the other one to go through, then suddenly you're stuck in this tunnel without the option to do that. So I'm still on the fence about whether the nets are a good idea, but both sides seem to be moving forward with them for now. The good thing is they're very easily repairable and replaceable if they are damaged. That's on the drone front. And on top of that, it's really now a war of infantry and drones. So in terms of the way the Russians are moving forward, meat assaults, that is kind of still what it is. But what we're talking about at this point is small groups of around 2 or 3, usually not many more than that, just creeping forward with the idea to make it as far up the field as possible. Very often they pass Ukrainian lines, which are more and more overstretched, and they just dig in a bit further. They go from one hole to another hole. And at this point, because the gray zone is so wide, because everyone's constantly got their head down because of the drone threat, there's less of a need to actually conduct assaults in the traditional sense of the word. It really is just about creeping forward, staying unnoticed, digging in, and eventually causing chaos for the defense. And unfortunately, on the Ukrainian side, because the infantry situation is so bad, and it's almost impossible for it to get better, unfortunately, because of how with every month the battlefield risk profile gets deadlier and deadlier. They're super overstretched, and they have these big holes in the front line which the Russians creep through. And very often you hear stories of the Russians starting to randomly make it past the Ukrainian infantry and start assaulting the Ukrainian drone teams, which are further back, maybe a kilometer or two behind what should be the front line, but what is now a really porous front line. The good news here is that that's still definitely the exception, and Ukraine has gotten so good with their drones, and they still have shells at their availability as well, that most of the time these groups are eliminated long before they get close to the Ukrainian infantry. But going forward, it's again one of those things where it's hard to imagine the manpower crisis being solved, especially for the infantry, and Ukraine will have to learn to fight in this new way, because they don't have what Russia has, which is what they use for these assaults, which is this endless supply of expendable infantry.
Well, thanks, Francis, and thanks to everyone at the Kyiv Independent for the work you do. As you know, I do read every day, and your continued attention and focus on detail is very much appreciated. The India's running a membership drive at the moment, I understand it. What's the latest offer?
At this point, we see fewer and fewer international teams regularly bringing the front line to audiences. So that's what we're trying to do, and expanding the way we do it in text and video. And it was good news when we were able to, after a long campaign, reach 20,000 members. These regular contributions is how we're able to keep doing what we're doing. But in the meantime, we're still trying to grow and solidify that community. And so if you want to make it possible for us to keep doing what we're doing, joining that community is definitely the way to go. Thank you.
I just noticed, I've been keeping an eye on the news as we've been chatting, but I do notice that President Zelensky met with Keith Kellogg, Trump's envoy to Ukraine, and said they had a productive meeting. Don't know what that means, but that came out of that interaction. But also, and perhaps more importantly, as part of the continued transformation of the executive branch, and this bit of a reshuffle that we were expecting, in the last hour it's been announced that President Zelensky has made Yulia Sviridenko the new Prime Minister. So I think it was Denis Shmyhal before. So Yulia Sviridenko, who was the first Deputy Prime Minister before, he's now bumped her up to be Prime Minister. Francis, what do you make of Yulia Sviridenko being made Prime Minister?
I think probably we're going to see the first act in a larger reshuffle. I mean, Shmyhal has been here for years. He's been the Prime Minister for the whole time during the full-scale war, and including before that. It's not that brings a lot of attention to itself when a lot more focus is on the presidential apparatus itself and then the defense minister. And speaking of the defense minister, that's where we've heard a lot about him probably being replaced. Zelensky talked about it himself, that he could become ambassador to the US because he apparently gets on pretty well with the Americans. But then, of course, that means a new face for the defense ministry, which is one of the most important jobs in a country at war. And we don't really know who that could be at this point. So Sviridenko, she's right up there in the inner circle. She negotiated the minerals deal. But going forward, I think the defense minister position is going to be the one to look at.
Lovely. Thanks, Francis. Well, as you say, going forward, we will keep an eye on that, and we know you will as well. So thank you and the team. Thanks for everything you do. Please pass on our best to all your colleagues at the Kyiv Independent. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Francis and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Durnley, Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.